Hello and welcome to the Night Watch Show, Conspiracy Edition. Today I am going to attempt to tie together a lot of comments and replies and great feedback from all of you, and I appreciate the many great responses we've had to our recent videos discussing conspiracy theories surrounding loss of privacy in 2020, and many of those also involving the COVID-19 and potentially long-term loss of privacy rights based on the pandemic. And unfortunately, what we've seen in the past when faced with major global or regional or country-specific tragedy, there are steps taken that not only address the immediate problem, but also unfortunately result in the long-term erosion of freedom. For example, after the horrible tragedy and attack on America, 9/11, the lingering effects so long after until this day are a massive loss of privacy rights of people that have nothing to do with such an attack, such ideology, and would never be party of that in any way whatsoever, and are completely against it to their very core, and yet the privacy loss affects everybody. For example, in America today, based on the FISA legislation, which was just recently renewed in the last few weeks, we're at the point where web browsing history is not private in any way. It can be browsed by law enforcement, federal law enforcement, without warrant, which essentially means it can be archived and indexed. It's not that someone's sitting there watching you browse the web, it's that for all of time, that information is archived and searchable by law enforcement and can use it to identify ideologies and thought processes. And if you happen to be considering building a storm shelter to guard yourself from tornadoes in the great state of Arkansas, for example, and you're also interested in possibly having a rifle, and you're searching for those two things, and suddenly it looks as though you're an extremist who's wanting weapons and a bunker, when in fact you're just wanting a rifle for home defense purposes and a shelter in case of storm. Suddenly you're on a list somewhere. Does that matter? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But the question is there a time when that will be used against you in a way that you've done nothing wrong, however you're put into a category that you shouldn't fall into? So there are just a lot of concerns over loss of privacy, and a lot of those concerns has to do with how much does everybody trust their government. Every government's different, every government has different rules and laws. However, the question is, how comfortable are you giving up your freedoms for the sake of, quote, the greater good? The question is there a case where it is not used for the greater good, and loss of privacy and loss of freedom and loss of rights is actually used against you in unexpected ways, such as who would have thought that from 9/11 and the fallout of that tragic attack on America with mass devastation and loss of lives, who would have thought that so long after, to this day, the FBI can look at our private browsing history without warrant? That's an unanticipated, unexpected consequence that one could argue has nothing to do with what happened on that tragic day in the history of America and of the world, and yet we all still pay a price, which is loss of freedom and loss of privacy. I really personally don't have anything to hide with my browsing history, but despite the fact that I have nothing to hide with my browsing history, I don't really like the fact that I don't have privacy in my browsing history. And let's just say, for example, that you're traveling to a country that does have issues with certain types of searching. For example, there are certain countries where if you say the wrong thing, no disrespect to those countries, every country is different. Every country is made up of laws for specific reasons, and I think the populations of those countries generally tend to accept those laws. But if you're a foreigner from that country traveling there and you've said the wrong thing, at some point in your browsing history life, search for the wrong thing, type the wrong thing into a message, and the government whose jurisdiction you're now in has access to that information, and now you've made a statement that could possibly result in a 10 or 20 year prison sentence, you may not be very happy about that loss of privacy. For example, when you travel through airports and you use airport Wi-Fi and you opt in and consent to very long agreements you probably don't read, what's embedded in some of those agreements, if you did read, might really scare you. And what may be installed on your phone by utilizing that airport Wi-Fi might also disturb you. And not only that, but having APIs such as Apple iPhone introduced a recent version of iOS, which essentially provides contact tracing, not on an optional basis, but it installs the API in all iPhones in the world once you install that update, or buy a new iPhone, I'm sure it will come pre-installed. And that contact tracing API means that with the addition of an app, which could be easily downloaded in an internet packet, probably from airport Wi-Fi while you're traveling, or through an app that you download or that health authorities require that you to download for good reason, or perhaps as spyware in an app that you don't realize includes contact tracing features, which could be private, could be from troll farms and hackers, and it could be from government agencies. And in any case, there are backdoors in certain platforms out there that has come up in the past. There have been allegations made against various tech giants about placing backdoors for intelligence purposes. So the point is, once your cell phone has API that allows contact tracing, you're just one click away, one download away, one app away from having available to whoever has access to it, essentially everybody who you've been close to, using a cell phone or a tablet or a computer, assuming Bluetooth is enabled. And even if it's not, I'm not completely familiar with what capabilities it will have based on Wi-Fi, based on cellular signal, but there's certainly advanced tracking capabilities that I believe go beyond Bluetooth technology. So for example, your barista at your local coffee shop, the waitress that you tend to see at the same restaurant every day, your friends, your family, your coworkers, those you talk to, it's all put into a web of contact tracing where essentially governments or even hackers or troll farmers or whoever it may be that has access to that app data that's connecting with your phone's installed contact tracing API basically is able to see everyone who you've been in contact with and when and where, and also who they've been in contact with, and put together a vast web of very high level intelligence that essentially means we no longer have privacy in who our friends are, who we hang out with, where we are, where we go and with who. If you add that in the context of browsing history not being private, essentially everybody can be archived and monitored and stored and searched and indexed through various types of intelligence databases for all of eternity. And if it turns out that you said the wrong thing once in the wrong country, and somehow that's either in a message, in Messenger, in your browsing history, and you also just happen to have physically been in contact with someone who maybe you were standing in line with at McDonald's or at Burger King or who knows where, and that person has extreme ideologies and they had similar search history, and suddenly now you're grouped together with someone who you have nothing to do with, and you've had contact with someone, and you're now looked at as some type of a renegade, a suspect. It puts you into a group of bad people to watch carefully, for example. So that's why the reason I'm not comfortable with contact tracing. Now, if it's used for the greater good, if it's used to track those that have been infected with the COVID-19 to make sure that they comply with quarantine measures, that's one thing. If it's used to monitor high-risk individuals for the duration of their high-risk period of time for the sake of controlling the pandemic, that makes sense. But if it's for the sake of a long-term, never-ending contact tracing, which if you look up the definition of tracing and tracking, you'll find that they just happen to be essentially very similar words. If it results in the long-term, sustained usage of contact tracing in our electronic devices forever, just as 9/11 led to legislation which eroded our privacy rights to this day, and resulted in such outcomes as web browsing history not being private. And there's a whole lot more to FISA if you research that on the internet. You'll probably be shocked if you haven't already read about it. And in each country around the world, that's US based, there's different legislation that has similar outcomes, and each country has their own set of rules. So the question is, once these measures are introduced, even though it's about the current pandemic, of course governments will want to make sure that the next time there's a pandemic, we're better prepared for it, which makes sense. And that, I would say, is for the greater good. And so then governments would argue, why remove contact tracing? Why not have it continuous, so that when the next sign of a virus that could potentially become an epidemic or even a pandemic arises, we're more prepared? That makes sense. But then the question is that information used for other purposes, such as the post 9/11 legislation has led to all types of different uses of those loss of freedoms and privacy rights that have nothing to do with 9/11, that have nothing to do with attacks against countries, but have to do with completely unrelated matters, and yet law enforcement has open-ended access. So will law enforcement have open-ended access to contact tracing / tracking, which would be one of the most sought after law enforcement and intelligence tools in the history of the world, to be able to legally track everybody wherever they are, whoever they're in contact with? And by the way, why not have their browsing history as well? So I think that is really quite scary. And also, as you travel, you become subject to the laws of each jurisdiction in which you may find yourself. Over time, these laws, with different leaders and different presidents and different elections and different regime changes and things that happen around the world, privacy you give up today that may not mean a whole lot, may mean a whole lot 10 or 15 or 20 years from now, when the world is quite a bit different, when leadership structures have changed, and who knows what outcomes will be there then. So honestly, I'm quite concerned about loss of privacy rights, because it's a slippery slope where when you give an inch, they take a mile. When I say they, I mean the powers that be. Now, some comments that I've had that are interesting and fair points to make: what is the harm in giving health authorities access to contact tracing? I think what some of you don't realize is that in many countries around the world, health authorities are actually federal employees reporting to top-level administration that hold cabinet positions, that essentially report to the president, the prime minister, the emperor, the dictator, the king, whoever it may be around the world. The point that I'm trying to make, without really meaning kings and queens and so forth, the point I'm trying to make is that government federalized health officials in some jurisdictions have direct influence over military and law enforcement, and can even influence arrests and detentions and imposition of lockdowns and quarantines in communities and for individuals, and have quite a bit of power. So health authorities become indirectly, in some parts of the world, an extension of law enforcement and intelligence gathering. And it's only a step away from health officials to government officials, to federal officials, to law enforcement officials, to military, law enforcement, and political officials. So there is no real guarantee that contact tracing will be limited to, as many of you I think assume, will be limited to doctors and health officials trying to save us all amidst the pandemic, which is a valid and great cause for contact tracing. The concern is, once that's embedded in all of our technology that we use, our computers, our cell phones, our tablets, etc., even our watches, such as the Apple iWatch, once it embeds itself everywhere, does it really go away? Once it's used and has backdoor access by government officials, even within the health authority realm, does that open the door to access by government officials in various other realms and politicians? And if you happen to be in a country where if you think the wrong thing, say the wrong thing, connect with the wrong person, you've broken the law. And I won't name specific countries at this time, but there are countries out there, I think, that you know of, where saying the wrong thing is actually a crime that can put you in prison. And also communicating with, directly in contact with the wrong person, could make you a suspect of having similar ideologies, which you may not have. And in many countries, having a certain ideology will put you in prison. And that ideology may simply be disagreeing with current policy. So depending on where you are in the world, this may have different impact on you, but just keep in mind, you may feel in your country very comfortable with the lack of privacy, but when you're traveling to other jurisdictions, please keep in mind that it's very easy for apps to be installed knowingly or unknowingly through downloads, through airport Wi-Fi access. And it is even possible in the fallout of the pandemic that as you enter countries and go through immigration, you may be required to install apps on a compulsory basis onto your devices that allow for contact tracing in case you happen to be carrying the virus with you. They may want to keep track of your locations, and they'd have every right to do that based on the current situation for fear of spreading the coronavirus, COVID-19, into foreign countries as you enter, whether you're a returning resident or whether you're a tourist or a business person. In any case, when entering a country, you may be required either knowingly by required compulsory download of an app that you give up control rights on your phone so that you cannot uninstall it and you cannot turn it off until they turn it off for you, which is quite possible and happens in some countries, by the way. Or it could be essentially put into your phone in stealth mode as you click and download and install whatever's required to access Wi-Fi, which in some airports it's not as simple as just connect. You actually do have to download and install, and there are various ways that this can be done on a backdoor basis. So once contact tracing is there, can you get rid of it? Does it go away? Is it misused? Do you really want to be on a trip somewhere and because you happen to have a drink with someone who you had no idea has very severe opinions that are quite negative against the current administration in that country's government, you're now labeled as a hostile person within that country that needs to be watched carefully and tracked and perhaps even interviewed and perhaps even interrogated. And this can go down to various dark slopes. So that is why personally I'm not in favor of loss of our privacy rights. Now, I am in favor of when someone has been infected by COVID-19 and is on home quarantine, for example, or hotel quarantine, having contact tracing to ensure that they comply with quarantine rules and to make sure that we're able to see who they've been in contact with. But should that be something that endures for all of time, as FISA has, as web browsing history not being private anymore has, will contact tracing also become just part of the new normal that we all have to accept, that essentially governments around the world will know where we are, what we're doing, who we're with, who we've talked to, and who knows, perhaps even what we've said. Smartphones are really the greatest surveillance technology and intelligence gathering technology that's ever been available in the history of the planet. Being able to potentially, and this certainly can be done, if anyone doesn't believe this, research and you'll find it can be done. Governments can access your cell phones and listen and see through cameras. In some countries that requires warrants, in some countries it may not, but contact tracing plus the ability to essentially access your phones remotely, including GPS, locations, and even listening and seeing. You put that all together and goodbye to privacy and good luck to having a private life of any sort. And if you just happen to run into the wrong person and say the wrong thing in jest, but the thing that you said in a joking manner is taken seriously, and suddenly something bad happens to you, is not a good outcome. So in any case, I want to discuss that a little bit further. That is really inspired by the recent announcements and implementation of contact tracing in smartphones around the world. Thank you for joining this episode of The Night Watch.